Welcome to another episode of the Back to School Shootings Podcast, the only podcast where we have uncut conversations with some of the world's leading experts in school safety. And the guest today is Dr. Beth Sanborn. She's the president of the Pennsylvania Association of School Resource Officers, and she's a retired police officer. She worked for 18 years in patrol and her final 7 years as a school resource officer in Pennsylvania. And this is a really important conversation to have because over the previous episodes of this show, we've had discussions with a school resource officer and school security director, discussions with an armed school administrator, and then recently a couple talks about research about the potentially negative impact of school policing on students. So I really want to make sure that we have every perspective available from people who work in schools in various different capacities and people that really understand how school policing is different in lots of places across the country. So Dr. Sanborn, thank you so much for joining the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I get incredibly excited whenever I get the opportunity to talk about the work that we do.
So the work that you do now, you just retired after a pretty long career across law enforcement in Pennsylvania, and you're now working as the president of the Pennsylvania Association of School Resource Officers. But before we get to where you are now, I'm kind of interested in where you started, where you went to school, and what made you interested in policing.
Well, it's funny that you should say that because I had no idea that this is where my path would lead me. And that's actually a really important point that we'll come back to a little later. I knew what I wanted to do from the moment I was a wee little kid, and I knew that I wanted to work with sharks. I was going to be on a boat in the middle of the ocean researching sharks. And the first time I got on a boat and I realized how seasick I got, I realized I was going to have to come up with a plan B because that just wasn't going to work for anyone. Like many traditional students, I did okay in high school. I didn't really know what I wanted to do after the marine biology and shark thing fell through. So I went to college on an impulsive decision. I was recruited for sports because I was a pretty good athlete. I wound up going to Widener University in Pennsylvania, Chester, Pennsylvania. And I was undecided. It turns out I was a good high school athlete. I was a mediocre, at best, college athlete. So that didn't work either. So now let's come up with a plan C. I wound up taking an introduction to criminal justice class, and I fell in love with it. I was one of those students that sat front row center, and my face is very expressive, and I was always very engaged. And the professor could gauge how the class was reacting, oftentimes by my facial expressions. And when I started to learn more about criminal justice, I realized that I was a sociologist at heart, that I really loved studying people and why they do what they do, how they act, how they react, how they interact with each other. And I realized that this was an industry where I was really excited. So I started taking more sociology classes, more criminal justice classes, and I always knew that I had a good heart and that I wanted to help people and I wanted to be the person that made someone's day better. Now, lo and behold, I'll tell you, I come from a suburban Jewish household. We have lawyers and doctors and accountants. And I realized that I wanted to be a police officer because I wanted to help and I wanted to do good, which didn't really go over well in my family. But I have a drive and I knew that I could do good for my community. So I finished college, put myself through the police academy. I got myself a police job. I was 21 years old, working in the suburbs of Philadelphia as a patrolman. And I loved it. But
before we get into, I have first two questions for you. First, working as a patrol officer in the Philly suburbs in, I guess, the late 90s, early 2000s at that point, did you still carry the wood baton?
No wood baton. In fact, if I remembered what my gun belt looked like in 1997, I don't even know that I could explain it.
Because that's been one of the standards in the Philadelphia Police Department for a long time. So just wanted to check on that. And second, because my academic background has been in sociology, in criminology, and then also in criminal justice. I've been in PhD programs for all of those. What, in your opinion, is the difference between criminology versus criminal justice?
Oh my goodness, I wasn't expecting this. Okay, so talking about when you're studying theory based on studying practice and how the theory gets put into practice, and which comes first? Are we understanding the theory and then trying to fit the study of folks to put into that theory? Or are we studying behaviors and then trying to figure out why those behaviors are existing? That may or may not answer your question, but I think it's almost like, which are we putting first?
I think that that's a good representation, and it's something that I didn't understand initially. I thought that criminal justice and criminology were two terms that can just be used interchangeably, and I think in a lot of academic settings they are, because they all might be lumped into the same department. But yeah, I agree with that. That criminology is a branch of sociology that's highly theoretical, whereas criminal justice is the applied application of how we deal with and measure and address crime across policing, courts, and corrections. Which is why it's the academic on ramp for a lot of people that end up working in police departments, or as with your family. It's kind of interesting. A lot of people take that as their ramp into law school, to be a district attorney or so on. So sorry to cut you off there. So you have your first police job in your 20s, working in the suburbs of Pennsylvania. What's that like for you as a woman? I mean, women were probably still not real well represented in law enforcement in the late 90s.
That's true. And I did have to prove myself. There's no doubt about it. I came from a sheltered background, and here I am carrying a gun, a badge, and keys, and here you go, kid. It's like, wait a second, what? I didn't have a whole lot of life experience that prepared me for this. So it took a little bit of time, but the way I established myself was, number one, not being afraid to jump in and get involved. Number two, not requiring to be treated any differently. If someone else was expected to do a job, I'd be just as happy to do it. And I have always set the standard that you volunteer, you set yourself apart from others in a positive way. If something needs to be done, jump in and offer to do it. If somebody needs help, put your hat in the ring. How can I help? How can I make your day better? How can I make your job easier? And not being expected to just have things fall in your lap. If you want something, you've got to proactively go out and get it. And that's how I've lived my life, and I've worked my career. It turns out I was, by my definition, fairly successful. I was a frontline supervisor. I was an officer in charge, a field training officer. And again, I realized I wanted to set myself apart from my colleagues in a positive way. I went back to school and I earned my master's degree from St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia, also in criminal justice. And once I did that, I decided that I had to do something with my degree. It's Listen, education is something no one can take away from you. You should always continue to work on yourself and become a better person, learn more, and hear different perspectives. But I wanted to do something positive with that. And that was when I first started teaching as an adjunct instructor at a few local colleges and universities. I wrote my first articles, I got my first publications. And it was really because my mentor, a retired law enforcement officer turned academic, or a pracademic, as we like to call them, Darren Stocker, said, write an article. I told him I was bored on a night shift one night, and he said, write an article, talk about what you know. And that got me into the foray of having that relationship with other academics, with other publishers and publications and other authors, where we could really exchange ideas at a higher level.
And it
Like,
seems like there's a lot of tension that comes out. I mean, I see this in the comments on LinkedIn a lot, that practitioners and academics live in two different worlds. And I don't think that that's an accurate representation of a lot of academics, yourself included, because a practitioner can have an opinion. A practitioner can kind of represent that opinion based on the lens of their experiences, but there's nothing to really prove that it's valid. Whereas I think what people misunderstand about academics is that when you write something for a journal, you are now going to be exposed to first a set of peer reviewers who are going to challenge and poke holes in every one of your arguments. You need to defend those to the editor and prove that you're valid. And then once it goes out in a journal, that journal is read and reviewed by people that know that niche area very, very well. And they are also going to really scrutinize your opinion. So when you are a practitioner plus an academic, you're now taking your life experience, you're taking your personal experiences, you're applying some sort of research methods to them. You're putting that into a format where you're going to have peers scrutinize your ideas, and then you're putting that forward to the world. And that's the opposite of living in a glass tower. Like that is living in the glass house and letting people, throw stones at you from every direction. And I think people just, there's a general misunderstanding of what it means to be an academic or a pracademic, as you say there.
I do love that term. I think it provides a unique set of lenses because you're right. You do get to combine those two facets, the boots on the ground with the research that's provided surrounding it. And when you can really combine those two, you can engage in some really healthy discourse and conversation to talk about, why is this happening? Well, is it really happening? What does it look like when it's placed into practice? And when I realized where my niche was in law enforcement and where I could do the most good. And I'm kind of jumping forward a little bit to how I became a school resource officer. I realized that I saw what I was doing and I met other unicorns like me in this industry. And I realized I had to use my voice for good to be able to talk about what it was that I was seeing that we were doing on a day to day basis and how I was nothing special in that there were about 20,000 others of me across the country who were engaging with their kids in a similar fashion and whose kids were engaging with their SRO in a similar fashion.
So then, based on kind of your career timeline, when you moved into being a school resource officer, you were still part of your municipal police department, and this was what, around 2010 or so. You moved into, was it an SRO division in that jurisdiction? Kind of, can you explain the process for how you'd go from being a patrol officer and being a patrol supervisor and FTO into then working in a school?
Sure, sure. Well, so it was the end of 2014. I was still in patrol. I had the day off and I was grocery shopping. And I got a text message from my lieutenant that said the school district is thinking about starting this school resource officer program. I don't really know what it looks like. I don't know what it's going to involve, but I think it would be a really good fit for your personality. Let's put an asterisk there. I think it'd be good for the police department. I think it'd be great for the school district. Are you interested? Oh, by the way, the hours are Monday to Friday, 7 to 3. And I responded in a way that no grown woman should probably respond to their boss in all caps. Yes, with all sorts of exclamation points and emojis. I was very, well, exclamation points. I hit send. I was incredibly excited to start this position, kind of craft it into what I thought it would be. But the school resource officer does have a federal definition. And here's where it gets complicated. So a school resource officer is a sworn law enforcement officer who's hired by a governmental police department and organization who was then assigned to work in conjunction with a school district under community policing standards. So that is a definition. That doesn't change. Now, where that gets morphed is that oftentimes when folks see school-based police officers or school security officers, they kind of get lumped into that term, school resource officer. And it's an important distinction because when you adhere to the gold standard of school-based policing as set forth by NASRO with the stamp of approval from the federal government, NASRO being the National Association of School Resource Officers, you want to have someone who is very carefully chosen. So that was my lieutenant saying to me, I think you would be a really good fit for this position. You want to make sure that they are properly educated because policing the school is very different than policing out on the streets. I like to call it policing through a new set of lenses so that you're properly selected, you're properly trained, and that you're properly equipped to be able to do your job. But you have to understand that the role of policing in a school is more than just law enforcement. Many of us, myself included, got into law enforcement because we wanted to help people. We wanted to do better for our community. So school resource officers adhere to the triad. It's a three-pronged approach where we serve as law enforcement, we serve as informal counselors and mentors, and public safety educators. And the great part about that dynamic is that you can spend as much or as little time on any one of those prongs as is needed by your community or by your school.
And then in that, just before we get into, your orientation there in Pennsylvania, um, there are a lot of different ways that school police departments can be structured. So there can be a municipal police department that assigns officers to schools. There can be standalone school police departments. So, for example, Los Angeles County School Police Department is the oldest school police department in the country, back to the 1940s. And then every employee within that department is a sworn officer within that department. But there are also like a pretty old school policing agency from the 1950s. Was New York City had a school police department, but the majority of employees were not sworn officers. They were like kind of school guardians that were, not a sworn police officer, not an armed officer, but they were employed by this larger school safety department. And then there are also all of these kind of informal mechanisms that are used in a lot of smaller jurisdictions, where you might have an officer assigned to a school, you might have an officer who has an overtime detail to a school, or maybe they're a retired officer that the school then hires into a school policing capacity. How do you, as a researcher and advocate and representative of a large organization, kind of deal with all of these different types of school policing configurations?
It's complex, it's muddy, it's messy, it's confusing, it's ever evolving, and it differs from state to state. So, yeah, there's that piece to it too. Oftentimes, there will be a legislative change post tragedy, and there'll be a knee jerk reaction to enact something into law to require schools to adhere to it, which may or may not be funded or unfunded. There might be criteria where there's compliance checks to ensure that it's being done or not. So, oftentimes, especially post tragedy, I want to take a moment to breathe. Take a moment to step back, to look at things objectively. What was done, what was successful, where were failures, what can be done better, what do we need? And then be able to parse out the noise of folks who try to monopolize on these tragedies. To be able to say, wait, we have to make sure that we're doing this at the right time for the right reason. And it's the safety of our schools, it's the safety of our kids, it's the health and the welfare and the well-being of our communities. And if you're truly invested in the health of your kids, the success of your kids, you want to look at things from an objective standpoint. A lot of the work I do, I tend not to use the word I, it's we. No one person has the answer. No one mechanism is the answer. It's such a complex beast. And then you're also dealing with human behavior, which can't always be predicted. It can be unpredictable and throws a wrench into the works. This is so very complex. And what we need to do is we need to work together and we need to communicate with each other, whether it's the researchers and it's the practitioners, whether it's folks who have merchandise and equipment versus theoretical programs, whether it's threat assessment and threat management and software and hardware and people. And listen, there are plenty of shiny objects that are out there that tote that they're the answer to school safety and security. But unless you have good people who are developing, who are manufacturing, who are delivering, who are operating, who are training, who are invested, those shiny products don't mean anything.
I completely agree. So so then kind of getting back to Pennsylvania, so you get the text message from your lieutenant while you're grocery shopping to, you know, come work in the school resource officer division. So we talked about how they can be all these different orientations across the country. How was your department there in Pennsylvania structured, and what was your role there?
Well, I like to say that we are a teeny, teeny, tiny police department that no one had ever heard of before. I'm not even going to make you try and pronounce it, but I was the first school resource officer. I was the only school resource officer. So I walked into my high school January 5th, I believe, 2015, and the principal walked me around and showed me off to everybody. And we went into the cafeteria. And I'm telling you, I felt like the needle skipped across the record. That's for the old heads who understand records and needles. I was so immediately insecure. Every insecurity that I had just came flooding back up to the surface. Do I have a boogie in my nose? Is my zipper down? Why are my hands so handsy? What do I do? And I'm wearing a traditional police uniform, vest, gun belt, striped down my pants. I was so very insecure. So the first day that I was in school, nobody talked to me other than to make slide comments or snide comments as we walked past. I had two girls my first week walk past me in a hallway, and they're wearing, let me see if I can paint the picture, black tights, Ugg shoes, carrying a Starbucks drink, cute little sweatshirt, and they go, hands up, don't shoot. And I had a choice in that moment. How was I going to respond to that? I'm a uniformed police officer walking through the hallways of the school, and I could take it as an adversarial encounter. I could become aggressive, or I could use it as a learning opportunity, a teachable moment. I said, girls, I said, that hurts me here. I pointed to my heart, and it hurts me here up in my head. I said, listen, I am new here. This is my new post, and I have no idea how to get to J Hall from here, which was one of our hallways. Our hallways were lettered. And a spoiler alert, I did know how to get to J Hall, but I used it as an opportunity where I could walk and talk with these girls. I didn't even realize a walk and talk was a thing. I was putting things into practice which seemed to make sense. How was I going to build relationships and rapport with these students if I wasn't willing to engage with them, if I wasn't willing to be somewhat self deprecating, and realizing that, oh, by the way, kids do dumb things. Kids have always done dumb things. It's not our job to criminalize the dumb things that kids do. You're supposed to do dumb stuff. That's how you learn from it. You just hope that you don't repeat the dumb things, and you hope that the dumb things that kids do don't cause an irreparable barrier to their success in the future. But I would challenge any one of you, well, either you or your listeners, for someone to tell me someone that didn't do something dumb. So the girls and I walked and talked, couldn't tell you their names. It was one of my first encounters, but it's about building relationships and building rapport. It's that stability. It's being there for those kids every day, being another trusted member of that staff who's through their actions reflects their words to say, I'm here to help support you.
Now, do you think that that experience and that encounter, being the first school resource officer that these students were dealing with, would have been different if you were a 6'4", barrel-chested, bald man assigned to the school?
Um, you know what? I don't think it's based on your structure. I think it's based on your heart and on your minds. Because a 6'4", bald-headed, barrel-chested guy could be a parent, probably loves his kids, might be a coach or a mentor or a religious figurehead. So I think in that point, the one thing that I would suggest is that you have to understand that someone in uniform, while I like to think that people would encounter me and they would be thrilled and happy and feel safe and secure and supported that Officer Beth is here. All my kids from kindergarten to superintendent and everyone surrounding my schools, I was their Officer Beth. Um, but not everybody feels safe and secure when they're next to someone wearing a police uniform. Some people are anxious and scared and they feel hatred or annoyance or aggravation. So, what you have to learn, and this is part of our training, is that your police uniform makes noise and that your tone and your voice and your inflection has to be figuratively louder than the noise that's created by the uniform. Otherwise, all they're going to see is a gun.
And it's interesting that you point out that it's more about the person and the personality, because that I'll put a link to this in the show notes. But in one of the very first episodes, it's with Jason Shields, who's a school resource officer, now school security director in St. Louis. And he was in the Army before he went into school policing. But in the Army, he was a chaplain. He was in the chaplain corps. And he sees himself as somebody who's kind of a spiritual leader and an educator. And it's interesting that he went from patrol very quickly into the school resource officer division, because he saw himself as not a police officer, but as a mentor and a figure and a leader and a dispute resolver for the kids. And I think that can really get lost. But one thing that is interesting, and I'll also have a link to this in the show notes, to some research that you've done into school policing, is that there may be a unique role for women who often have a personality that may be aligned with kind of connecting and nurturing kids and students, that women are actually overrepresented nationally in school policing compared to men across police departments. Like, kind of, where did that finding come from, and what do you think the implications of that are?
Well, listen, you have to have the right person for the right job, regardless of what that job is. I mean, think about it. If if you're squeamish going to the dentist, like, maybe being a dental hygienist is not for you. Regardless of the industry, you want to have the right person in that job, which again falls back to the picking out the right person for the school resource officer. There's enough research out there that indicates across the board nationally, females represent about 12% of law enforcement. And yet, when we conducted this survey, my research team and I, it's called the Strategic Fit of the School Resource Officer amongst law enforcement and educators and the greater community. One of the demographic questions we asked was around gender. And what we found was, when we received our data back, and we had close to 2,000 respondents to a fairly involved survey. I was thrilled with these numbers. But what we found amongst our 1,700 SRO participants was that we had just over, I believe it was 17.3%, or just over 17% representation among women. So, which lends the question, like, it's interesting. Why were women so overrepresented in the school resource officer position? I mean, if you think about it, we're facing a deficit in law enforcement across the country. It's incredibly difficult to attract candidates who stay, and let alone for specialized positions. Typically, you're not going to put a school resource officer you're not going to put a police officer into the role of school resource officer without having a good few years of experience and really understanding what the job is about, applying those soft skills, learning the workings and the availabilities of resources within your community, how the juvenile justice system works, criminal justice system. So you need to have an officer with some stability who's been there. And by the way, who happens to be one of your high-flying officers. Putting an officer in a school should not be where you put your guy who is retired on duty, who is a menace to society, and you just want to hide them off in the school. When you are working with kids, you are one of the most highly visible officers. You become the face of your department because everybody knows you. The kids know you, the parents know you, the community knows you, your reputation precedes you. So you want to have that employee in that school who can work well without immediate supervision, who can write a great report, who not only acts ethically, but gives the appearance of ethical behavior as well. So when you have a shallow pool for law enforcement, getting these other unique facets and roles filled is difficult. You want to make sure you've got the best of the best in that position.
Well, that's what's really interesting, because when you talked about that first text that you got from your supervisor, you mentioned that 7 to 3 was a big appeal to that. And I think a reason that a lot of women may not go into policing is the schedule. If you're a mother, being on night shift can be very difficult. If you're a small woman, working midnights and working by yourself might not be an appealing work situation. But if you know that you can work 7 to 3 in a school. You can be primarily around kids. You can be primarily mentoring rather than doing patrol policing. That might be something that's very attractive to many women across the country who would think that policing or law enforcement is not a career that would either be appealing or work for them.
Okay, so let's go back and revisit that for a moment. The hours of Monday to Friday, 7 to 3, were very appealing. I have now been married to my husband for just over 25 years. We just celebrated our anniversary. He
Congratulations.
was, thank you. He was a police officer for 25 years. I was one for 26 years. So our schedules through the course of our marriage and our children's lives were very complicated. If you go into the position of an SRO thinking that your hours are 7 to 3, and once 3 o'clock hits, your problems are done, see y'all tomorrow, this might not be the industry for you, because where do kids struggle? Well, they are going to struggle in the evenings. They're going to struggle at home. They're going to struggle outside of the school hours as well. So I often realized that 3 o'clock would come. I would leave my school, go back to the police department. I would go home. I would get home. I would open up my computer and I would start what I called round two. And that was when I was working with the social services providers like the Office of Children and Youth and social workers. And that's when we were talking about therapy for kids. That's when we were talking about wraparound treatments and various interventions that could be put into place. That's when I was doing home visits to make sure that kids had food, to make sure that they had heat and electricity in their house. That's when I was working on lesson plans because I was going to teach about vaping or about a proper dating relationship or the legal ramifications for drug and alcohol use. So 7 to 3 was great on paper, but it wasn't the reality. And one of the ways that I built a relationship with my kids, and I wanted to take a breath there because it still holds true today. I gave all of my kids my cell phone number, all of them. Parents had it, teachers had it, it was plastered on my door. I talked about it in assemblies. I made their kids take their phones out and plug my cell phone number in because I said, if you are ever struggling, if you're alone, if you're scared, if you see something that makes you feel uneasy, you call or text me. I don't care what time of the day it is. I also made it very clear that this was only to be used in a proper manner, not to be abused, and that all communication was going to be safe.
Well, that's first an incredibly gracious effort because I made the mistake of putting my phone number on my undergraduate student syllabus that said, contact me if you have any issues. And lo and behold, only a week went by before I got texts at 2 a.m. from somebody that was having trouble logging into Moodle to post their assignment for that week. So I cannot even imagine what sort of texts you got and what time. But maybe that's a whole separate episode. but
Well,
yes,
what I
that does
can
make a great point that being accessible to the community is really a core pillar of that school policing role.
Well, and think about it. If you've got a kiddo at risk who feels as if they're unseen, who feels separated out from the community, nobody sees them, nobody cares about them, and they're feeling alone. And they're stuck inside their head in the middle of the night, and nobody cares, and nobody wants to talk to them, and nobody thinks they're worth anything. Reaching out to Officer Beth is going to get you somebody. Now, those people don't necessarily walk around with a spotlight on them in the hallways so that I can identify who they are. I can tell you, though, over the course of the 7 years, I can count on one hand the number of times I got improper text messages or contacted. Oftentimes it was a bot. But my students understood and felt that when I told them I loved them, and when I told them I was there for them and would help protect them and keep them safe, that I meant it. So even just this week alone, and we're January of 2025, just this week alone, I had a former student of mine reach out to me, Miss Beth, I'm having some problems. What's up, hon? Let's talk. Now, okay, mind you, she contacted me through another number because I no longer have that work number. She needed money. She was on food stamps. Her food stamps had been compromised. She didn't have anything for the baby. She didn't have anything for herself. She needed a couple bucks to get her through until her food stamps came through, until grandma could get her to the store. So I sent her a couple bucks because that's what you do. When you tell your kids that you love them and that you're there to protect them, then you follow through with it, because kids will know when you're lying to them. They know when it's not genuine, and they know when you're trying to take advantage of them. And if that's your role as school resource officer, if you are there for 7 to 3, and when 3 o'clock comes, you're off duty, then maybe that's not the right position for you.
Now, that does bring up an interesting challenge with workforce management and time management and budget management and burnout, which unfortunately, from I've studied more than almost 3,000 shootings at schools. So I think it's about 10 incidents away from hitting the 3,000 mark. And the most common time period for a shooting on campus is dismissal and sporting events. And those are two times that are going to be butting right up to the end of an 8-hour shift for a school police officer. And another incident that always comes to mind is there was a targeted attack by a former student in Texas 2 years ago, and this was at a high school in Dallas. The school campus doesn't open until 7 a.m., but students get dropped off and arrive at all different times. So there were 50 or so students on the front steps waiting for the doors to open. A student who was having an issue with another student committed an ambush there on the steps, and the school had 2 school resource officers, but their shift doesn't start until 7. So, you're a police officer at 6:50 when this shooting took place. You're using the bathroom. Your radio might be sitting on the charger. You might be taking a shower after you did PT before your day starts. School policing can be 24/7, but it's not resourced and budgeted to be 24/7 in a lot of cases. And expecting an officer who's on a 40-hour week to be available 24/7 can be a tremendous ask. Kind of, how do we balance the realities of that in really resource constrained environments?
That's a fantastic question. And I will tell you that towards the end of my career, I was begging for help. I was desperate for help because our it was post pandemic. Behavior was escalating, violence was escalating, mental health concerns were escalating. I loved what I did. I still love the industry. I love my kids. I will always love them. I don't know how you balance that. I did it because I believed in it. So I put in way more than my 40 hours. I darn near worked around the clock. And yeah, I suffered burnout. I suffered fatigue. And I was waiting for the day that my 2 biological children asked me, how come you care more about those kids than you do us? Which, by the way, I mean, I love my 2 kids. But I also knew that my kids had a solid foundation. I knew they had electricity and food and a mom who said, I love you, probably way more than I needed to. I knew that they were brought up with a good morals compass, and that they had good values, and that we are good people. And not every kid has that. Not all families have that. And I wanted to parent all of them. So I don't know how you balance that. You have to find the right person who believes in it.
And this is obviously not to put you on the spot as an advocate for school police officers, but one of the early episodes was with Robin Cogan, who's the former president of the National Association of School Nurses. And as you're talking, the way that she talks about caring for students and mentoring students and being the only one who might be able to give them a hot meal or access to a shower in the nurse's office or clothes or things like that, that is exactly the mentality that she has. A school nurse is a very important position. It's also, unfortunately, one of the most poorly paid positions across the country. The average salary for school nurses is like $35,000 to $40,000 a year. So a school jurisdiction for the cost of one school resource officer could potentially have 3 or 4 school nurses working in that school. It's going to be a multiplier for the way that they can connect with students. Unfortunately, when schools are resource constrained environments and you have a set pot of money, you can only have so many police officers, so many nurses, so many special needs student assistants, so many social workers. how do you find the best balance of what meets like the greatest student need?
Yeah. Wow. Isn't that the $1,000,000 question?
Unfortunately, there's only $1 million, and we have to decide, what mix of those people are right for the students. But it's interesting hearing you describe your work in policing, and the same as Justin Shields and his work in policing. It was very little policing, and it was mostly being an advocate and a supportive person. And there
Right.
are a lot of people in those roles in schools every day that are doing that for the fraction of the cost of a police officer.
Yes, I agree. And as much as I'm going to be an advocate for SROs from sun up to sundown every day, um, we are not the answer. We are a part of the answer, which is why, again, I talk about that collaboration and the importance of communication. Yeah, you need a nurse. Yeah, you need a social worker. I mean, there is a mental health crisis. I mean, there is an epidemic that's happening, and we need to be able to support our children. And if we, as the supporters, don't have a strong, healthy uh, foundation, how are we expected to help others? So, yeah, that is a really difficult balance. And a school resource officer is quite an investment. There's no doubt that you can get a lot of cheaper options, but you're also getting what you pay for. There is something to be said for an invested professional who is invested in their career, invested in their community, and wants to see a successful, healthy community. Many police officers live in the area where they work. They want their own children safe and secure and supported. But think about it like from Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you don't feel safe and secure and supported, you cannot elevate up that hierarchy to be able to achieve some of those higher functioning abilities. You have to feel safe and secure. And yes, while there are plenty of roles that we fulfill in schools where we act as a nurse, we act as a crisis counselor, we act as a guidance counselor and an educator, when it comes to a school shooting, a mass active casualty, we are the only ones who can neutralize that threat. That is the single task function that we serve. However, that is, while it is a tremendously high impact, it is a low incident. And therefore, and during the times, we are proactively building relationships so that we can help be a part of that prevention model. Because if you don't have a relationship with a kid, if you don't feel as if they can talk to you when conversation could flow easily, they're not going to come talk to you when the conversation is going to be hard. They're not going to come talk to you when they overhear leakage, when they see a drawing on a wall, when they see a drawing on a notebook, or oversee someone's computer screen where they're investigating guns or tactics or weapons. You have to have someone in that school who's willing to put in the time and the effort and the energy to become integrated to that school environment, to be another set of eyes and ears, and to enlist everyone else around them to be their eyes and ears to help keep that environment safe.
And it's interesting that you pointed out earlier that the school is not where you put the retired officer. The school is not where you put the person that, had multiple knee surgeries and can't do a foot pursuit anymore, or the folks whose goal in the police department is to be wider than they are tall by the time they get out. I mean, we've seen all of those situations. But you made the point that it is the highest profile position in a department. For a lot of kids in that school, it may be the only interaction that they've ever had with the police department. And what's interesting is this school is the nexus potentially for a lot of different public services. The school nurse may be the only healthcare professional that students see in that community. A social worker or mental health counselor might be the only access that a kid has to that. So actually, the school is this nexus where you're in an under resourced environment, an environment that's only going to get worse because all the indications are from the new administration that education funding is going to be cut, that federal funding is going to be cut, that social services programs are going to be cut. So the school is not only the only place where kids are interacting with these pillars of society, but you also need the best possible provider to be the one that's there representing it within this resource constrained environment. So what do you see as somebody who has a leadership role in school policing? What do communities need to know and be thinking about to make sure that they have the best available people working in the school and they're balanced across all of the different needs that students might have?
Well, that's a fabulous question, and I love that I get to answer it in this way. First and foremost, I'm going to say meet your school resource officer. Go up, shake their hand, introduce yourself. Hi, how are you? It's nice to meet you. Because it's important to, first of all, put a name to a face and to understand the position. I spend much of my time educating on the role of the school resource officer because if you don't know who we are, there may be this perception that we are just that lone wolf cop who's walking the hallways, proactively patrolling, swinging around that wooden baton, smacking it on lockers, demanding hall passes. And that's not at all who we are. If you understand that our training goes into learning about the teenage brain, about de escalation skills, about marginalized society and building relationships with diverse students, about soft skills, about learning how to teach. Police officers don't typically get that, about active listening skills, about threat assessment and emergency operations plans. There's a tremendous amount of education that goes into this position. Again, we are not the dumb brute cops walking the hallways looking to assert our dominance. I like to call it a time period of emotional neutrality. Ready? This is when I get to sound smart sometimes. It's a shared commonality. Nobody likes getting up and out of bed in the morning. But when you are all inside that school and you have that shared environment, you're all there together. You can all complain about how cold it is, how dark it is at 7 o'clock in the morning in December, when you can kind of be miserable because you know it's meatloaf day and the whole school smells already. You're interacting with a police officer during a time period of emotional neutrality. There's no immediate crisis. You're not interacting with the police officer because you just called 911, because you were just in a vehicle accident, because something had just been stolen from you or that you were victimized. You're just there together. You kind of lament the fact that you have a gym class first period and you have to get out of your winter clothes and get into a bathing suit and jump in the pool. I mean, while the SRO isn't doing that, nobody's going to enjoy that. But you can talk about these things together because you have that shared school spirit. So when the public learns that there is so much training that goes into the position so that we understand education language, FERPA, IEPs, 504s, manifestation hearings, when you can search, when you can't search, TLO versus New Jersey, educational case law, the Constitution, when we can talk about Tinker versus Des Moines and First Amendment rights, folks tend to be surprised. There's a lot to our environment. Please watch us interact with your kids, and more importantly, more telling, watch your kids interact with us.
So, thinking about kind of the history of policing in the United States, from the 1800s up until the 1950s, police officers walked beats essentially within a community. And the main way that they were alerted to issues were by community members coming out to stop them and say, hey, I've got a problem, because we didn't have 911 service until the 1970s. We didn't have portable radios until the late 60s. So a police officer was not somebody that's being called by dispatch to respond to calls. They were somebody that was walking the streets in their neighborhood, either proactively identifying issues or being summoned by people that they knew because they're around them every day to deal with the problem. And that was how policing was done in the United States for more than 100 years. Now, as policing has changed and it's become patrol-based policing, where officers are primarily in a car and they're going from service call to service call, and they don't really have interactions with citizens outside of those service calls, your description of school policing is completely different. It is completely different from patrol policing. And we have a couple functions in law enforcement across the country that are also distinctly different from patrol policing. The Secret Service, which is primarily a protective agency, goes to their own academy where they learn about executive protection. The FBI doesn't do patrol policing. They go to their own special academy to learn about investigations. If you were in charge and you had a magic wand, should there be a federal school policing academy completely detached from municipal departments, completely detached from patrol, where officers learn from the start about the school environment, about working in the school environment, and that's a completely separate discipline of policing from municipal patrol policing?
Absolutely. There is a tremendous amount of value in, excuse me, in broadening your repertoire of skills. I mean, when you put a police officer in that car and you roll those windows up, there's already a barrier. There's a barrier to that, and it interferes with the relationship building. When you're walking through the halls of a school, you are integrating yourself. You're building those relationships just like that old original foot patrol in the cities. You get to know which classrooms are louder than others. You get to learn what's normal for your school environment so that you can recognize when something is out of the norm. That's the value there. If you were unfamiliar with my schools, you may walk through the school one day and it might give you the appearance of being a homeless shelter because there's kids laying on the floor in the hallways, there's clothes spread everywhere. But if you were familiar with our school environment, you would know that for our students who were already caught up on their work and didn't need any more intervention, they were permitted to go out into the hallway to work on projects on their own or small group projects so that they didn't disturb other students in the classroom. But if you're unfamiliar with the culture of that school building, then that would seem out of the norm for you. Having those community policing relationships and skills is why we do what we do. We can't be entirely reactive. We have to be proactive and help to maintain that safe environment through all that we can.
So we're running out of time now, but I want to ask you the same question from three different perspectives about school policing. And that question is, what makes a good school police officer? And the first is, if somebody listening is a supervisor in a police department who's in charge of deciding which officers are going to be assigned to schools, how do you look at your pool of officers and decide who's going to be a good school police officer?
Okay. First thing I'm going to say is ethics. It's not enough to act ethically, but also the appearance of being ethical. That can be difficult to teach. Tactics can be taught. Active listening can be taught. Morals and values differ. That's incredibly important.
And so, this supervisor, there's a position opening up in the school and there are 20 officers that just applied for it. How are you going to decide who that person is beyond ethics? Like what is really what makes that somebody a good school police officer?
I want someone who is genuinely interested in the success of kids. Um, Most kids don't like cops. Most cops don't like kids. And you need someone who genuinely wants to see them succeed. I would want someone who is not hyper focused on statistics and arrests because the measure of a good school resource officer is not the number of arrests. In fact, I would venture to say it's the number of times you can divert someone away from the juvenile justice system. As far as that school to prison pipeline goes, school resource officers are the ones who are trying to weld that shut to divert kids away from it with alternative dispositions or other mentoring and counseling opportunities. So I want someone who's ethical. I want someone who has good skills that they can communicate. You have to communicate differently with a kindergartner than you do with a parent, than you do with a high school student, than you do with the school nurse, than you do with the superintendent or the media. You have to be able to understand that each different group uses a different set of languages, They use different words and are at different developmental ages and stages. So you have to be able to communicate effectively. You have to be genuinely invested in your community and willing to be part of a team. If you're that my way or the highway kind of guy or gal, it's not going to work. When you're an SRO, you're a guest in that schoolhouse, which means you have to be able to work with educators and have a seat at the table and have a voice, not the voice.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. So then, kind of this same question from a different angle: if a high school student or a college student approaches you and they say, "I'm interested in policing, and I specifically want to be a school police officer," what does a high school or college student need to do to make themselves the best qualified person for that position?
Again, it's making yourself stand out for the positive, constantly working on yourself, educate yourself, make sure that you can read and write and communicate. Stay current on trends. Be very, very wary of the slippery slope of social media. What I like to talk about when it comes to social media is that my barometer is: would my mother, would my boss, would my husband, would my kids, and would my religious figurehead be okay seeing what I post? And if those five folks would be okay with seeing what I post, I would say it's generally okay to post these things. Be careful about being too impulsive, but again, have that good moral compass and want to do good and do well for your community. It's okay not to know the answer. It's okay to find the answer and get back to someone who asks that question. Just having good communication skills and being reliable and dependable are worth their weight in gold.
And finally, if a parent approached you who's concerned that they don't want to have a police officer in their school around their kids every day, what would you tell that parent about the way that that officer is working, selected, intended to be there? How would you appease the concerns of a parent who thinks this officer is going to have a negative impact on my child?
I could completely understand that because everyone's had their own set of encounters, and that's what their experiences shape the lenses with which they see the world. I would invite that parent to come to a school function where the SRO was in attendance. Stand back and watch. Watch how they interact with the kids and how the kids interact with them. I actually wound up doing that with our newest at the time NAACP president was elected. And I went and I introduced myself and shared a little bit about my ideology. And I said, I would love to have you come to the school one day. And not because he was anti-police or anti-SRO, he was just a newly elected figurehead in the community. I said, come hang out with me for a little while. Come sit in my office. So that they could see how the interactions went and what a typical day looked like. Now, as typical as a day can get with a visitor. But I encourage you, see with your own eyes, talk to your kids, find out how they're feeling, what their experiences are. What do they see from the SRO? What do they know? Do they know the SRO's name?
Do you think that the push in some areas to fortify and secure and close off the school campus from the rest of the community is adding to that kind of fear and angst about what's happening inside? Throughout my time growing up, the schools were open places. The school campus was a place that we went after hours to play basketball in the school or do things in and out of the school or school activities. That having a fence, having a secure entry portal, not letting the parents and community members see and interact, and maybe the only thing you see at that front gate to the school is a person with a badge and uniform. Does that change the way that the community is perceiving the campus in a negative way?
Uh, I'm going to give a little wishy washy answer here because I see it as a double edged sword. Having all that fortification in place may allow for a single point of entry, a single point of exit. But again, if you don't have the right people, if you don't have good people maintaining and preparing and ensuring that that the school in and of itself is safe, I don't know what good that does. I'm always going to be reliant on people because that's the one facet that's going to be the most telling. We're going to interact with each other, and we're going to see and we're going to hear, and we need to be able to share this information. I was really surprised when I had candid conversations with my students and I asked them what their concerns were. And we gave them the opportunity. It was me and an assistant principal who sat down and brought a group together, and any student was welcome to come. It wasn't just any select few. And we asked them what their concerns were. What were they thinking about regarding school safety? And I was really distressed to learn that my high school students were thinking about school shootings as much as they were. I really wanted them to have that light and airy mindset. I wanted them to worry about getting pimples before the prom. I wanted them to, be worried about not tripping with a lunch tray in the cafeteria. I didn't want them worrying about school shootings. So giving students a voice in what they think they need and what suggestions and enhancements they believe would be valuable is also a tremendous amount of information. Do they see value in fences and metal detectors, and would that make them feel better? Do they see that as an opportunity? Or are they finding other areas of weakness in the school that we as the adults have no idea about?
Yeah, and I think just to a person who is in our shared circles and was a previous guest on this show, there's an opportunity for the school police officer to actually work directly with students on their safety. Dr. Ken Trump, who is Mr. School Safety for 5 decades, when he was a middle school student, the school police officer in his school back in the 70s had to write reports and didn't know how to type. But Ken Trump knew how to type. So instead of going to study hall, he sat with the school resource officer back in the 1970s and typed his reports. And he's been in school safety ever since then. So I think something that gets forgotten sometimes is that the students can be the biggest advocates for their own safety. The students are an extension of the school community. They want to be safe there in the school. And I think giving opportunities to work with, to mentor, to be part of the school safety team. I mean, I was a school bus patrol in elementary school where there was a school police officer who was in charge of the school traffic division and came around and taught us how to guide kids across the crosswalks and evacuate the buses and so on. We were the advocates for our own safety in the school. And I think a lot of that has been lost as students are seen more as, in some cases, the kids that need to be assessed and observed and assessed on a threat scale rather than kids that deeply care about their safety. So before we end today, is there anything that you would like to kind of leave the listeners with about where we need to go kind of into the future of school policing?
I think it's a matter of being receptive. And to touch on your last point is really giving our kids a voice. We as parents and as the adults have to put our egos aside and even sometimes our experiences aside. And let's talk to our kids. Let's find out how they feel, what they see, and what their experiences are. Because I think you'd be surprised. We as parents and as adults often speak for our kids, but we get the messages wrong sometimes, and we may have a skewed perception. I encourage you, meet your school resource officer, meet your school police officer, your school safety officer. Find out who they are. Ask about their families, what their preferences are, what their hobbies are. A good old fashioned meet and greet, sharing a cup of coffee or a soft pretzel, in Philadelphia. That's the way to go. And don't be afraid to talk to each other. I think you'll be surprised to find out that folks who work in a school environment are not afraid to talk at all.
Well, thank you so much. This was a great conversation. So, Dr. Beth Sanborn is the president of the Pennsylvania Association of School Resource Officers, a retired municipal police a police officer and a veteran of working directly in schools. So, Beth, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me. That was a blast.